Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in, shall we? Today, we're going on a fascinating, data-driven deep dive into a phenomenon that is literally reshaping our world as we speak: the mechanisms of modern democratic backsliding. We're going to look closely at exactly how and why the architecture of free societies is being challenged today. And to do this, we're pulling directly from comprehensive global research and real-world case studies. So, let's get started. I want to start off with a frankly startling data point: 91 versus 88. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly does this mean? Well, according to the consolidated data from the most recent VDEM 2025 report, our global political landscape has hit a critical, historic inflection point. For the first time in over 2 decades, the number of autocracies globally, which is 91, now actually outnumbers the world's 88 democracies. Think about that for a second. We've officially entered the third wave of autocratization, which is essentially erasing more than 30 years of global democratic progress. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by unpacking global democratic erosion, then look at the Autocrats toolkit and test that theory with our global atlas. Next, we'll focus in on the Italian anomaly and historical prototype called the P2 project before finally wrapping up with strategies for defending democracy. All right, moving to Section 1, Global Democratic Erosion and the Metamorphosis of Decline. You know, the way democracies die has fundamentally changed. We're really not looking at those dramatic, violent military coups from the 20th century anymore. To understand this modern, incremental erosion, which happens from the inside out and is executed by legally elected leaders, we have to make an absolutely crucial distinction. It's the difference between procedural democracy, which is just the bare minimum procedure of holding regular elections, versus liberal democracy, which demands the strict rule of law, the protection of minorities, and genuine checks and balances. The modern strategy is basically to maintain that procedural shell of elections while entirely hollowing out the liberal substance. Researchers call this executive aggrandizement, where power is systematically centralized right into the executive branch. And this brings us to a really brilliant concept coined by legal scholar Kim Lane-Shepley back in 2018: autocratic legalism. It sounds kind of like an oxymoron, right? But it's this paradox where political actors use formally legal tools, things like referendums or standard court appointments, to achieve completely illiberal, undemocratic ends. Legality literally becomes the perfect camouflage. Because there aren't any violent coups or sudden suspensions of the Constitution, it minimizes international backlash and keeps up a nice facade of legitimacy for the folks back home. Okay, Section 2, the Autocrats Toolkit, a step-by-step strategy. When researchers actually dig into this autocratization, they don't find random accidents. They find a highly intentional, standardized playbook that gets used across vastly different geographic and cultural contexts. Let's walk methodically through the 4 pillars of this toolkit. Step 1 is media capture. This means transforming public media into government propaganda, squeezing private media financially, and finally consolidating ownership under friendly oligarchs. Step 2, judicial capture. This is neutralizing the courts through forced retirements or pact appointments, which absolutely destroys horizontal accountability. Step 3 is constitutional engineering, basically changing the rules of the game, like messing with term limits or electoral districts to guarantee the ruling party can't lose. And finally, Step 4 is civil society repression, using heavy, exhausting bureaucracy and selective legal targeting to silence NGOs and opposition activists. It's incredibly systematic. Let's move to Section 3, the Global Atlas. Testing the theory. By examining the real-world data between 2005 and 2024, we can see the brutal collapse of democratic institutions in places where this exact toolkit was deployed without successful pushback. Look at this. Russia plummeted from a score of 31 down to just 5. Turkey fell from 48 to 9, and Venezuela dropped from 40 down to an abysmal 4. In all 3 of these cases, independent judiciaries and free media were systematically captured, completely transforming fragile democracies into closed or electoral autocracies. But, and this is important, outcomes definitely vary based on institutional strength. Take Russia, for example, which faced total media and judicial capture, resulting in a closed autocracy. Hungary saw significant media centralization and strategic judicial appointments, which landed it in a category of an electoral autocracy. In contrast, look at the USA. Despite experiencing normative stress and a highly polarized political environment, structural media capture didn't actually occur, largely thanks to a vast commercial market. And independent courts largely held firm against executive pressure. This really demonstrates the power of structural resilience.
Section 4, the Italian anomaly, unresolved historical tensions.
So, Italy provides a genuinely unique democratic laboratory for our analysis. The source data identifies Italy's historical anomaly as the lack of a clear, definitive institutional rupture with its fascist past. This is a stark contrast to the post-war transitions we saw in Germany or Spain. Because of this lack of a clean break, a persistent political subculture survived. And this subculture has historically maintained a deep distrust of liberal democratic institutions, generally favoring centralized executive power. This has profoundly shaped the nation's political dynamics for decades.
And the impact of this history? It's honestly staggering today. According to 2024 ISTAT data, there is a massive 67-point trust gap in Italy. Look at these numbers. 89% of citizens trust the firefighters, and nearly 73% trust the police. But trust in political parties, that sits at a really dismal 22.4%. This asymmetric trust, where citizens overwhelmingly prefer operative, uniform forces while deeply distrusting their own democratic political representation, creates a major structural vulnerability that's just ripe for populist, anti-system rhetoric. Compounding this issue is a serious vulnerability in the information ecosystem. Reporters Without Borders actually ranks Italy 41st globally in press freedom. To put that into perspective, that's the lowest in Western Europe outside of Greece and Malta. The data cites deep structural media concentration and intense political pressure on public broadcasting. Now think back to what we discussed a minute ago. This structural vulnerability perfectly, literally perfectly, aligns with step 1 of the autocratic playbook, media capture. Let's look at Section 5, the P2 project, a historical prototype. To really see how this stuff builds historically, we can look at the Propaganda 2 or P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy. When this network was finally uncovered, it wasn't just some fringe group. Out of roughly 962 members, over 20% were high-ranking military and armed forces personnel. Nearly 16% were high officials in the police, and another 16% were elite entrepreneurs. We're talking about a massive high-level infiltration of clandestine power across the absolute most vital sectors of the state and the economy. But what is truly startling are their documented goals. Their 1981 Plan of Democratic Rebirth explicitly called for a presidentialist constitutional shift to bypass parliament, executive control over the independent judiciary, the creation of a private TV monopoly to control the public narrative, and the marginalization of traditional parties. I mean, look at that list. These exact goals from over 40 years ago form an eerie, almost step-by-step blueprint for authoritarian restructuring that perfectly mirrors the modern autocratic toolkit we just talked about. And finally, Section 6. Defending democracy, strategies for resilience. Now, I want to be clear, the erosion we've charted today is not deterministic. It is absolutely not irreversible. The data points to 4 clear defense mechanisms for societies to halt this legal erosion and build real resilience. First, we have to fortify civic education and constitutional culture. Second, enforce strict media antitrust policies to prevent the kind of information capture we saw in places like Hungary. Third, fiercely protect judicial independence. And fourth, build cross-ideological political coalitions. And we know for a fact this works. Empirical data from recent elections in Poland and the institutional response to stress in Brazil proves that when independent courts stand firm and citizens unite across ideological lines, the autocratic playbook can absolutely be stopped and even reversed. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Based on the data, the playbook, and the historical precedents we've explored today, what is the point of no return for our democracy? I encourage you to look closely at your own civic environment. Are your institutions safe from the slow legal erosion of the autocrat's toolkit? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.